Get ready. The DE Talk podcast starts now. Insightful conversations and dialogue helping you put the human factor back in HR. After months of quiet, government agencies have advanced many policies federal government contractors need to be aware of, and in some cases, even moved timelines forward instead of delays. As federal contractors grapple with what's to come, the adjustments that need to be made, and how to tackle these new challenges internally, we'll discuss practical policies and practices to adopt in 2023 as you tiptoe through the minefield of regulations and laws. Welcome to the DE Talk podcast. I'm Candee Chambers with Direct Employers Association, and I have the pleasure today of welcoming employment law expert John C. Fox of Fox, Wang & Morgan back to the podcast. We will be covering a lot of ground today as we discuss what EEO, DE&I, and OFCCP policy initiatives well-intentioned federal government contractors should implement for 2023, given the push-pull of anti-discrimination laws that protect whites, Asians, and men, in addition to traditionally underrepresented African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and women. So let's dive in. Where would you like to start, John? I mean, wow, we've got a whole litany of things we could talk about today.
Oh, we certainly do, Candee, and glad to be here. And I suggest we start off with the new challenges that the Biden administration faces with a split Congress, although a little bit more power for the president and the Senate, but with a sure blocker in the House of Representatives. It seems like it's getting more and more extreme all the time, and there's going to be just nothing but fights.
Oh, exactly, and there's bipartisan issues in some of the agencies as well. But the one thing that I've noticed during 2022, and I think we're going to see in 2023 is, and I've learned a lot from you, they seem to have forgotten all about the Administrative Procedure Act. They seem to ignore it and just like slam their ideas forward and then end up getting caught in the background.
Well, what happened in 2022 was that the president was able to pass fewer than half of the total number of statutes through the Congress that went through in the Trump administration. Now, with the House having an absolute veto power of any legislation, it's going to be much, much tougher. And so what that does, as you saw last year, and what you're commenting on, is that the president will now drive his policy agenda necessarily through the federal agencies. And they're going to be stealing first base, as I call it. I hate the dreaded sports analogy, but in baseball you can't steal first base. But if the batter were to drop his bat and run down to the first base and stand on it, what you are left to do if you're the other team is to oppose that and call for the umpire to throw that batter off of first base. And that's what the agencies are doing beginning last year pretty noticeably, and I predict will be the tenor of 2023. They're going to say, we're doing this, you sue us to stop it, federal contractors,
exactly.
Employers.
Yeah, that's what I think is happening. By the way, kind of interesting, what do you think about Secretary of Labor Walsh implementing that Scalia's order in the Department of Labor and basically reversing ARB decisions? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's perfectly lawful to do. The Administrative Review Board was set up in 1996 by Secretary Reich in the Clinton administration because the secretary for decades had been the administrative court of last resort for all of the many hundreds of statutes that roll up with appellate rights to the Secretary of Labor. And they are about a decade behind. And so he set up this board with 3 members that have quickly expanded to 5 to deal with the workload. And so the secretary is the one that actually has the authority. He has delegated it to the ARB. So what, with great controversy, the Democrats attacked Scalia, and the community interest groups attacked Scalia for reserving the right to overrule what was then a Democrat-dominated ARB. And the Secretary Scalia never used that authority.
I was just going to say,
interestingly enough.
now Secretary Walsh has done it twice.
But Walsh has done it twice, and as to OFCCP cases, including one where the administrative law judge had found sweeping evidence of unlawful discrimination, but he wanted an even further remedy that the ALJ had ordered and the ARB had affirmed. So you basically have lots of layers of review, and the takeaway for contractors is you have to factor that into your budget and to your risk analysis of and the timeline of what's going to happen with your case.
And if you go to litigation, maybe not a good idea.
Well, you're going to have to go through another layer to get to the federal district court.
Well,
a lot of times I relish the opportunity to get out of the administrative forum and get to real Article III judges that are much more focused on the law and less on the equities. And we know in the administrative law judge ranks, they come of three stripes. There are those who are OFCCP lovers, and the OFCCP is always going to win 100 times out of 100. And then there's the three of them that are contractor lovers. And then there's three of them that are neutral Switzerland. So, boy, getting the right judge makes the difference in the decision administratively. And you hate to say that. You hate to think that that's the way the world works, but that's unfortunately the way the world works. When you get to a federal court, it's much, much more attentive to the law, Republican-appointed or Democrat-appointed judges.
Which is the way the justice system should be. You know, and for people who are not part of that area of life, you know, or introduced into that situation, even if they're a government contractor and you've never been through litigation, that's what we all expect, you know, is to have justice served. But
well, the rule of law is a big issue with lots of different tentacles on it, and that's what we were really just talking about as to the deviation away from the Administrative Procedure Act. Because the Administrative Procedure Act was written by the Congress to compel the federal agencies to go through a formal process that would allow transparency to the public and allow public comment to make these rules better and not have holes or gaps or confusions that don't apply crisply to the private sector. So avoiding the APA process is not only unlawful, but it usually makes for poor rulemaking, poor practices.
So interesting, you made the comment about the House of Representatives, but now the Senate has a lot easier time to push things through, but there again is going to be a division for political nominees. That should be easy, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what do you think, we just talked about this in our week in review yesterday, what do you think about Title VII and religion and the LGBTQ demographic? What's going to happen there?
Well, one of the places you will see rulemaking is where the Biden administration wants to reverse a Trump rule, because they have no other choice but to remove that rule through a formal rulemaking. And that's what you saw our report yesterday talk about 9 agencies led by the Department of Labor interpreting Title VII, or those statutes that these other agencies enforce that borrow and apply Title VII standards, like OFCCP as to Executive Order 11246, for example, and recognizing that since the Bostock decision in the Supreme Court, now almost 3 years ago, where Title VII now protects sexual orientation and gender identity, that Title VII became a statute divided against itself.
Yeah, and that's going to be interesting to see what happens.
It both protects sexual orientation and gender identity, but it also protects the rights of companies and employees to not be discriminated against because of their religion. So now where you have a religious, sincerely held belief that sexual orientation or gender identity offends their religion, now which one trumps?
Exactly, and with as we've seen with McCarthy becoming the Speaker of the House, with the far right even arguing that point, and then you see the Democrats and the left basically arguing that religion and LGBT demographic, that's going to be, I think, big news this year. don't
Well,
you?
oh, absolutely. And in the Trump administration, they resolved this issue by issuing rules, formal APA rules, that said that Title VII was going to exalt religious freedoms over sexual orientation
Yeah.
and gender identity. So what the proposed Biden administration rule is to flip that.
Right.
And to have sexual orientation and gender identity trump the religious objection, because several courts have interpreted Title VII, the statute, to say that where there's a statutory protection, then the religious right embodied in the statute does not apply.
Okay.
And the statutory protection for SO and GI prevails.
Well, I think you remember me saying a few years ago when Bostock went to the Supreme Court, just on a personal level, I don't think that it's appropriate for anyone to be discriminated against. I don't think that they can say that it's okay for anyone to be discriminated against. That's a better way of saying it.
Well, the
think
Congress
that's a problem.
really needs to straighten out Title VII on this
wholeheartedly
point.
agree.
I'm not sure that the EEOC or the OFCCP or the 9 agencies that have formulated this rule have legal authority to decide how the Congress wants to balance this issue. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, Candee, as you look at this issue holistically, and it's very complex legally, and it's very socially and culturally charged, of course, as well, and difficult for everybody on all sides of the table, is that there are 2 other sources of law that intersect this issue. One is the Religious Reformation Act of 1990 that gave statutory rights to religious entities, passed by a Democratic House, passed by a Democrat Senate, and passed by President and signed into law by President Clinton. So you see that this is not so much a political issue as much as it is a social and cultural issue.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is the Constitution. The First Amendment has a constitutional right. And one of the difficulties for everybody with this issue is that constitutional rights trump statutory rights. The courts will always try to not get to the constitutional issues if they can decide the case on these lesser grounds of statutory entitlement. But ultimately, if it comes to a clash between a constitutional right and a statutory right, the constitutional right is always paramount. It's always number one.
Well, I think, though, that we've seen over the last couple of years, there are a lot of things that do need to be updated, too. My point previously, there were a lot of situations in our past where it was, quote, I'm doing air quotes for people that have no idea, it was okay to discriminate. I mean, look at women. I mean, obviously African Americans over the years, but, even women were discriminated against. And, quote, that was lawful. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be updated, but we could talk for 2 hours about that, so I'm going to move on. But one of the things that I know you and I talked about, and we even commented in our Week in Review, with the Democrat-controlled Senate now, with the midterm elections, President Biden's political nominees or political appointees will now go through without any trouble. I think Kalpana Kodagal is one that kind of kept the EEOC from having a Democratic majority. The Republican commissioners could actually block some of the things that the Democrats wanted to move forward, and now they're going to be the underdog. Now they're only going to have 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and so a lot of things will be moving forward, i.e. component 2.
So let me go back and set the stage on this nomination issue. For nominees, whether they're judges or federal political appointees, the Senate only needs to pass it by a majority vote.
Right.
So 50 plus 1. They now have 48 Democrat senators. They have 3 independents
that
who
caucus
with the Democrats, so that counts as 51 Democrat votes. Although 2 of those Democrats have voted more often with Trump than with
It's going to be interesting now.
the Democrats.
But
So
Vice
that's a
President-
very weak issue
Yeah.
for a lot of the president's policy initiatives. You've got some liberal Republicans, though, who from time to time vote with the Democrats, depending
Exactly.
on the issue. But as to nominees, this should slide through much, much more easily, because this change in the Senate also affected the committees.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so the committees are now 8 Democrats and 7 Republicans.
So they'll
they
more
can-
easily
they-
get through committee.
They can get them out of committee, they
Yeah.
can get them into the Senate, and with 51 total, quote, Democrat votes, the president can afford to lose 1 Democrat.
Exactly.
So they'll have 50, and then Kamala Harris, as the president of the Senate, can cast a tiebreaker vote and get the 51 needed to move through. That's not to say, however, that the Republicans cannot stall the nominees, as you saw the Democrats
Oh.
very successfully do in the Trump administration.
Exactly.
And Trump ended up with only about half of his nominees. He put his emphasis on getting judges through and
Yeah.
ignored a lot of his nominees, and so a lot of agency senior political officials' jobs were left vacant.
Well, and you know, was it Carla Gilbride and I think Jessica Lumen? They've already been renominated, and I think Kalpana Kodagal has been renominated.
Correct, yeah.
As well, and so they were, you know, sitting there for a couple, or at least a year, if not longer, and now they're already moved through. Or
Well, Senate Majority Leader Chuck
Schumer.
Schumer did not have the Democrat
The
votes.
votes.
He had Democrat senator opponents of those particular nominees. Had he had the votes, he would have moved them. The lack of votes stops the candidate. If he does have his 50 votes, he's still going to face a lot of timing and procedural opposition from Republicans that they can deploy under Senate rules. But it's going to take about 3 days on average per nominee, as opposed to just having a unanimous vote of the Senate to approve, as used to happen routinely.
Oh,
I
I
mean,
know.
Ronald Reagan had his entire political appointee apparatus, 2,500 people, approved in the first 30 days.
So how long did it take you to get through committee? You were a political appointee.
But I didn't have to go
Oh,
to committee.
that's right,
We put
because
me
the
into
Employment
a-
Standards Board, is that
We
what
had
it
the
is?
Employment Standards Administration
Okay.
in between. They still don't think that OFCCP has to go through advice and consent
Okay.
of the Senate. I believe that is wrong. I believe since they abolished the Employment Standards Administration in the Obama administration, I now think that the OFCCP director
They should,
is
yeah.
a direct report of the Secretary of Labor and should be subject to advice and consent of the Senate.
We didn't have that as part of our notes. I just thought I'd throw that.
Well, the other part of this, though, is that as to Ms. Kodagal, her nomination is very important to the EEOC.
Oh, I know.
Because when she gets over there, and she will, unless there are 2 Democrat senators who are going to stand up and oppose her, then the EEOC, a bipartisan commission, will have 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, as you were just saying. And so now you will see for the first time, somewhere, I predict, around March or April of this year, when I think that timing would allow Kodagal to get through the process, you will see for the first time in the Biden administration policy coming out of the EEOC. Previously, when the Republicans controlled 3, but the president got to appoint the chair that runs everything administratively, including the important right to administratively call a vote of the commission. And you notice that Chair Burrows did not do so,
Oh, I know.
because if she had called for a commission meeting, they could move things through that 3-2 that she wouldn't want. So they were stuck. This is like, you have to think about it like volleyball. In volleyball, you only score points when you're
When you're
serving.
right.
So the Democrats were serving, but they didn't have the number of bodies to win. They didn't have 3. The Republicans had 3, but they could only block. They
Yeah,
weren't
they couldn't
serving,
serve.
so they couldn't get any policy through.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, there was a lot of places that the commission could have had bipartisan support. bipartisan activity is not unknown. In the legislature in 2022, 95% of the bills that were passed were totally bipartisan.
Well, and I think that's what the constituency wants. You know, there really aren't that many people that are far right or far left. They want people to play well in the same sandbox. But to that point, I mentioned the EEO 1 component 2. And Jocelyn Samuels, the vice chair, I remember saying at one point, I think last year, is that if that comes out, you need to make sure that you get some comments out there immediately. And you know that Direct Employers does that on behalf of our members. And, you know, I think that's something that every organization needs to comment about. Because I think even the California pay reporting has been proven to not really provide the information that they were hoping to gather from that. And it's a lot of additional work for nothing, so.
Well, two things. We are going to see component 2 wage and pay data reporting come back to life again, the horror of the employer community. The timing of that, I think, is in part administrative to get Codegol through. The EEOC is locked and loaded, ready to issue the policy. They know what the mechanics and details are. They will seek comment, and that process has to go forward. But there's also a political component to it, because this is about the women's vote. Politicians don't care about equity, women, men, pay, means nothing to them. What means to them something is power.
And where the votes are going to come from.
The president has signaled very strongly in the last 3 weeks that he is running again in 2024. Number 2, as part of that, he has signaled very forcefully in the semi-annual regulatory agenda that he wants the agencies to move up into 2023 all of their rulemaking. And he has expedited, which you almost never see in the last 30 years, the issuance dates of federal regulations, because he doesn't want these to be spilling over into 2024.
When they're preparing for the elections.
For the November 2024 presidential election. Usually there's a shutdown period when the agencies are instructed to go silent in every administration, Republican or Democrat. Usually that was around April, May. You saw it in the Trump administration shut down around April. I believe that the Biden White House will shut things down as early as March of 2024, because the election, the last 2 rounds, have been the tightest in history, both his presidential election and then these midterms. And as a result, they don't want to risk anything. But this issue of component 2 is one that they may want to have come out closer to the election, because they think it's a vote that will attract women.
You know, I just have to throw this out there, though. I've done affirmative action for years. And when I first started doing, we would send in aggregate compensation data. And then they switched it to individualized compensation data, because the aggregated data didn't show them anything. Then they wanted individual data. And now they're going back to, let's do this EEO 1 component 2 in aggregate form.
Well, that was my second comment to be about this component 2. The entire employer community unanimously, I don't think there was a single dissenting voice, thought that the component 2 hours worked and pay data that we turned in was A, worthless. It wasn't going to help advance the cause of pay equity one little bit.
No.
And 2, it was extremely expensive, extremely burdensome. So why do this useless thing? We have found that with the California pay initiative. It hasn't told us anything. It's not useful for the enforcement agencies because it was heavily modeled on the federal model.
Yeah, exactly.
So now the question is going to be, are they going to come up with something useful? Oh, and by the way, in the first round of component 2, most of the OFCCP senior career officials agreed it was a worthless exercise. It was politically motivated, had great political mileage around it, but it didn't help them at all. In fact, this administration has gone back and pulled out those data to see what it might tell them. And of course, what you've seen is silence,
Nothing, yeah.
because there is nothing to be gained from those
And that,
data.
I think, I'm all for figuring out how we can have greater similarity in pay, but we need to stop comparing apples to oranges, and I really, don't get me started, but I think that there's got to be a better way for that to move forward and to get people to feel good about trying to come up with a solution. And I think, it is a long way from that point right now. So anyway, let's talk about the budget. I noticed on the news this morning, the debt limit. That's the latest news, and I think tomorrow's the 19th. And so they're going to run out of money tomorrow, right? And they've raised the date limit, or debt limit, I can talk, the debt limit, I forget how many times they said. I wanted to remember, and I was doing several different things, 73 times or something, some ridiculous number. What's going to happen? What do you think?
Well, we technically run out of money as a government tomorrow, says
So we just
Secretary of the
print more?
Treasury Yellen. But last Friday, when she testified before Congress, she invoked something called emergency measures, and that has many different tentacles, but she will start delaying the expenditure of federal resources and can probably get to June, is the Treasury Department's estimate, before they run out of money in fact and default on paying back bonds and debts. But they can furlough federal employees, and that will probably happen if the Republicans and the Democrats don't get here. They will start, by the way, in order of the least important to the security and safety of the nation. So the armed services are going to be the last to be furloughed. They will probably never, ever be furloughed,
Right.
given the tensions in the world. Then Department of Health and
Homeland Security.
Homeland Security. Then HHS, because it goes to the security of our health system. But EEOC and OFCCP are agencies that, among many others, will be vulnerable to furloughs if it comes to that. But I think everybody's going to work very hard on both sides of the aisle to delay that. And the Treasury Secretary can delay payment of government contractors, which would be a bad thing that could be a byproduct out of this. And it's probably something that the Democrats will think about as a way to get the business community behind raising that debt ceiling to allow the spending that has already gone forward and to allow more spending. I mean, one of the oddities is that bad for Republicans is that prior presidents, Trump and Obama and now President Biden, have spent more, they've authorized and signed bills into law that will cause more spending than there is available money to pay.
Yeah.
So they've got to raise the debt ceiling, or they've got to do a tremendous budget cut. Of course, the House Republicans say, cut the budget way back, find the money through that you need for the future through savings on the budget. Don't authorize just a never-ending printing press.
Well, isn't that what we're all supposed to do, is balance our budget? I mean, for a company, for our own individual expenditures, I mean, I don't spend more than I make.
Well, I remember when we had a crisis in Washington in 1981, when we hit for the first time $1 trillion, and people were catatonic. It's what led, by the way, to the passage of the ADA. The ADA was not something that anybody wanted to pass to help the disabled community. It was, if you go back and read the legislative history, they were very blunt. It's unfortunate to look back in retrospect and see this candor, but the stated purpose, and this is why Republicans passed the bill when no other labor bills had passed for the prior 3 years, was because it was a debt reduction act to move off of the federal payrolls and the federal cost centers about $286 million, the GAO estimated at the time. A fourth of $1 trillion would be pushed onto the shoulders of employers, it was thought, and onto the shoulders of the states, and relieve the federal government of a fourth of their debt.
I don't know how you just whip those numbers out of your head, 40-some years later.
Well, it was pretty startling when I read the ADA, and I was very active in it at that point. But the point of the story is now that we hit 20 trillion in 2017 and caused President Trump to just go catatonic. And now here we are 6 years later hitting up against $31.3 trillion.
That's insane. I mean, that's insane.
The second highest debt we've ever had. You have to go back to World War II and equalize the dollars from then to now to see that we had more debt then.
Yeah.
But we are now about a
the
year
value
and a
of money.
half of our annual gross domestic product in debt.
Oh, I know. That, when I heard that, I about went catatonic myself. So what do you think is going to happen with the OFCCP? You know, they're not doing many audits, although they put out a compensation directive that I have to admit doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. You know, they cite 41 CFR 60-217B3, but they say that, you know, they are allowed to, or that contractors are required to do extensive evaluations of compensation. Well, I'm not reading that, you know, and then they say that you have to provide the documentation based on 210, and, you know, and that's basically a record-keeping, you know, type issue. And it's the very last sentence in 210 or 2.10, and it kind of blows my mind. And you know, I consider myself somewhat intelligent, and they started asking for, you know, different types of compensation analyses that I can guarantee you the average contractor isn't doing. You know, compa ratio, I'm familiar with that, cohort analyses, obviously regression analyses, but some of the stuff they were talking about is Greek to a lot of people, I guarantee it.
So let me start at 30,000 feet here, because you notice that the EEOC publishes every 5 years its strategic business plan. It publishes annually its strategic enforcement plan, a separate document. The OFCCP does not publish its strategic plan. Senior officers at OFCCP know what they're doing. They have a plan that they amend from time to time in their minds and their discussions. But it has changed dramatically, and it's driven by two forces. There's two drivers. The first is budget considerations that form increasingly in the last 10 years the strategic plan for OFCCP. They have not been treated well by the Congress, Democrats and Republicans. They have stair-stepped down since the first year of the Obama administration through a 100% Democrat Congress, House, Senate, White House, and they stepped down further in the Trump administration. They stepped down in the Biden administration. They are now stable with this year's big budget that landed, but that means that they just don't have to fire anybody. They don't
Right.
have to lose any heads. They're going to be stable at about 420 employees are authorized. They are routinely higher than that because they have about a 25% turnover, unfortunately, of their new hires these days. So you got to hire a lot more just to stay even. You need to be around 450
exactly,
just to
yeah.
hold 420. By the time of the end of the year, you know, you've lost 100 people. But the second thing that drives is their policy considerations. And what you've seen because of the budget constriction and their difficulty driving forward the OFCCP just day in and day out operationally, audits have dropped to record lows for the third year in a row. Collections are falling from back pay dramatically from prior years.
Oh, I just heard yesterday a couple of our members saying that they submitted information last May and have not heard the first thing from a compliance officer.
Well, part of that's budget driven, part of that is the morale problem. It's always
Maybe
had a
the
morale
compliance officer
problem.
isn't even there any longer. That could be it too.
You're seeing offices shrink. You're going to see offices disappear this year. They are slowly, quietly, this is part of a strategic plan that's not announced or publicized. They are shrinking this agency down from the 72 offices that used to be there when I was helping to run OFCCP to what is now fewer than 40, depending on how you count offices and A lot of them don't have managers. They have remote managers beyond just the field stations, which is a place that never had managers, Alaska, Guam, that kind of thing. But the point of this is that they're migrating, I believe, intelligently to a point where they will be working remote. 4 years ago, I gave a major presentation at a national convention of federal contractors, suggesting that OFCCP should really be 1 or 2 locations. There's no reason to have brick and mortar stores anymore. Since they can audit remote, they've then proved that in the COVID-19 pandemic, where they all went remote for the better part of 2 years. So that's where they're going, but they're not announcing that because it's very politically sensitive.
Yeah.
The union fights it every step of the way. Congressmen don't like to see brick and mortar federal establishments disappearing from their tax base. They don't like any of that, but that's where it's going. You're going to see a lot of disruption. Contractors are going to see a lot of delays in the audits. The running time on audits is sometimes 6-8 years now.
So you mentioned an interesting point when you talked about budgets and furloughs and things like that, and the EEOC and OFCCP might be likely contenders for furloughs and that sort of thing. What is your opinion on the similarities and the work that they're doing together? I mean, the OFCCP I saw in the Federal Register just yesterday, so we'll have it in our week in review next week, but information about what they'll do with complaints in the OFCCP, which we've talked about them not normally being ones that focused on complaints, but that's normally an EEOC thing. And I've seen last year the EEOC, regional EEOC offices, putting together webinars on how to develop an affirmative action plan. I mean, there's so much overlap. And, over the last 5 or so many years, they had talked about the OFCCP and EEOC combining. You don't hear that anymore, but you see all of these things that they're doing together.
They're just running in parallel.
Yeah,
It's like
why?
Teamsters hooked to a wagon, pulling the wagon together. President Carter laid down the rule set in 1978 when he created the currently known OFCCP, previously to that known as OFCC.
Right.
But he consolidated all these agencies, and he designed the mission of OFCCP to be systemic discrimination and working with federal contractors to ensure against discrimination through the vehicle of affirmative action plans. By the way, a lot of people think affirmative action is different from discrimination. They're 2 different beasts. The Harvard case that we're going to see, because what really you need to think about it is that affirmative action is to, as the executive order says in its second sentence, to ensure, ENSURE, non-discrimination, to make the federal contractor be proactive. That's what's different than being a Title VII employer where you just receive inbound complaints. But in so stating, what he did was to remove all of the complaint jurisdiction from OFCCP and send it over to the EEOC, other than the VEVRA complaints, because the EEOC
Doesn't
had no
handle
VEVRA authority.
responsibility,
But
exactly.
the 503 complaints could
EEOC,
come in,
yeah.
but most of them were pushed over to the ADA, which
And
had
the
better
OFCCP
resources.
and EEOC have an MOU. And,
Right.
and yeah, so I just don't get all this.
So the Trump
And I'm not the only one, by the
administration
way.
issued a new MOU to formalize what the Obama administration had been doing secretly and quietly in violation of the MOU from 2011 by taking in individual complaints, because the Obama guys wanted to have those sexual orientation and transgender complaints that their regulations authorized them to prosecute, even though the EEOC could not intake those under their Title VII authority, not until years later with the Bostock decision.
Yeah.
So we now see with Jenny Yang, a former EEOC chair
Exactly.
and
Yep.
former EEOC commissioner, further homogenizing the two and having the two run parallel, and she's now homogenizing the complaint process at OFCCP, which used to be 300 a year under VEVRA. It's now swollen to over 2,000
Yeah.
a year since they've begun to open the door. And by the way, that's why audits are going to continue to shrink as that complaint inventory goes up. You know, the EEOC routinely gets 60 to 90,000 complaints a year, depending on the
Oh, I know.
economy. If OFCCP started getting into the complaint business, it could swamp the boat and just take all the resources, because their regs say that they must investigate.
Exactly.
The EEOC doesn't have to.
Right.
But the OFCCP must
must.
investigate every complaint that is jurisdictional to them.
So maybe they'll limit their work, not limit, but focus their work on complaints and they've been talking about targeting contractors, so maybe they're gonna focus on compensation. They want to focus on the bad actors in the contractor community, and maybe that's why they're really
Complaints are a
focusing on
bad
their.
way to go, though, Candee. Historically and currently, at the EEOC and the OFCCP, over 80%, it's usually around 81, 82%, of all complaints, charges at the EEOC, complaints at the OFCCP receive, are found to lack probable cause to believe a violation of the
Right.
statute existed.
No, where I was going though was maybe they're going to focus and target contractors with compensation, because they're really livening up their compensation focus. But and now with the order that Secretary of Labor Walsh is freely using, if a contractor argues back, they're really not going to have much of an
there'll be a
opportunity to
political
win.
response at the top.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I agree with you, Candee, that the business plan for OFCCP has also changed away from enforcement, in part because of the budget, but also because Democrats like to leave legacy architecture behind. The Republicans just like to be good stewards when they're running the OFCCP. They don't like to change things too much, typically. That was a little bit different with the Trump administration, where they got a little bit more aggressive on a number of issues. But typically, the Democrats want to leave architecture. They want to leave rules for their successors to have to be bound by. And so they have changed their emphasis and their focus away from enforcement to building rules. It's going to be a very active spring, for example, for federal contractors, because major rules on 60-2, affirmative action plans, what they look like. The first time we've looked at those issues since 1999.
And they're going to
rules that
firm up
became-
information on 2.17B3.
That's part of the affirmative action
Exactly,
plan.
yep,
Other
yep.
things you got to do. That's where your
gonna firm that up a
action-oriented
lot.
programs, your self-audits, self-evaluations. We haven't looked at any of this since 2000.
And, a lot of it, like I said, a lot of things do need to be updated. I think that's where government contractors really do need to make sure their voice is heard. So, all right. Well, given that all we've reported in the OFCCP Week in Review, we, as you just said, John, have identified numerous proposed changes coming down the pipeline in 2023, and especially as politicians gear up for the elections in 2024. So if you aren't a current subscriber of the Week in Review, we welcome you to subscribe again to subscribe to gain regulatory insights that you need to be aware of in the coming months. To do so, you can visit directemployers.org/subscribe, and we'll add you to our mailing list. It's perfectly free, and we have thousands of people from, I think, every country in the world is reading this. I always scratch my head and go, how did you hear about it? But
And
they
I heard
did.
we had a 17% growth on what was already the #1 blog in the EEO
Yeah.
government contractor space.
Yeah, it's fun and it's free, so it's not free to us. We kill ourselves each week, but anyway. So John, thanks again for your insights. It's always fun to talk with you about regulatory information with so much transpiring in the contracting space. You're obviously going to be really busy this year. Direct Employers is here to assist. If you do have questions or need any assistance, don't hesitate to contact either John or me, and you can reach me by emailing compliance@directemployers.org or just Candee, CANDE, @directemployers.org. And John, what's the best way for listeners to get in touch with you?
Oh, they can just put Fox Wang Morgan in their browser, and it'll find it. Wang is spelled WANG, A as in Apple, N as in Nancy, G as in go. That's always the hard one. foxwangmorgan.com, and there you are.
All right. Well, John, thanks again. This is always a lot of fun. Really appreciate having you today.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you for tuning in for another episode of the DE Talk podcast. Stay connected with direct employers on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and subscribe to our emails by visiting directemployers.org/subscribe to receive notifications of new episodes, webinars, events, and more.